Welcome back to the kitchen. For dinner tonight, I thought I would prepare a roast pork, one of my all-time favorite meals. I love roast pork, not only for dinner, but the next day for sandwiches and so on. It's one of my favorite meats, actually, roast pork. And the cut of meat that I am going to use is actually a shoulder blade roast, they call it here in Canada. It used to be called shoulder butt roast. There's all kinds of various names, but now at least where I live, they are referring it to as a shoulder blade roast. This I have here is actually half of one. When we buy a whole one, it's just too much for Thelma and I to eat all in one sitting. So I usually cut them in half, and we get a couple of meals out of it that way. And anyway, so this is half a shoulder blade roast, pork shoulder blade roast, and I'm going to show you what I do to prepare it. Now you have to make sure it's completely thawed, because what we want to do here is take the strings off it that it comes on, tie it up with, and see what we have inside. Now sometimes these roasts are solid, and you actually have to cut them open to do what I want to do. Other times, it looks like this one is like that, they just kind of fall apart when you cut that string off. And that's okay too, because we're going to put some seasoning on the inside of this, and then we're going to tie it back together before we put it in the pan. So what I like to do on the inside of the roast like this, and this was actually pretty good because it's divided just about in half equally. So we're going to put a little bit of salt and pepper on the inside of this thing. We're also going to put some Dijon mustard. It's one of my favorite seasonings, Dijon mustard. I use it in a lot of different things. You don't need a whole bunch in here, but just a little bit, and we'll just kind of smear that around a little bit. Get one half it covered here. And the other thing I want to put in there is some fresh sage. And fresh sage is quite amazing. It's really a lot different than dry sage that you get as far as the flavor goes. It's just a beautiful flavor. So I'm just going to cover this half of this thing with some fresh sage leaves here. And so they'll cook right inside that thing. So what we're going to do here next is roll this thing back up, and we're going to tie it up. Now I like to, when I pick out these roasts, I like to get one that's got a nice solid fat cap on it like that. And when it's in the oven, I like to have the fat cap up. That kind of bastes the rest of that roast as it cooks. So now what we need to do is retie this thing. So I have a ball of string here, and we're just going to, we'll put 3 strings on this thing. I think it came, and it only had 2 on it when I got here, but we'll put a couple more on it after this one. So what I do is I go around here twice, and that, especially if it gets wet when it comes in contact with the meat, then it doesn't come undone. It'll stay tight, and then you just take one more simple overhand knot and tighten that up good. And that's how we do. Cut the ends off. So we'll do a couple more. I'll put one here in the middle. Once, twice, tighten that up. Now I used to cut meat many years ago. I was a meat cutter for a little while, and they had a really quick and fancy knot they used to tie the string back up, and I can't remember what it is. It was a lot quicker than doing it this way, but you know, I'm not doing it every day for a living, so I don't have to worry about speed too much. Anyway, so this is just some cotton kitchen twine. You want to make sure it's cotton. You don't want any kind of synthetic in the oven that might melt and contaminate the meat. So there we have our roast pork that's been stuffed with sage leaves and Dijon mustard. And the next step for this is to take and brown this on all four sides in the pan that I'm actually going to cook this thing in. And then we'll put it in the oven. So once we've got a little bit of brown and everything, we can shut this burner off. And before I put it in the oven, what I like to do is I like to use this is actually a cooling rack for baking. It fits inside this frying pan perfectly. So we're going to take this little cooling rack and lift the pork roast up, put the rack in there, put the pork roast back down on top of that rack, and that's how it's going to go in the oven. With that roast up to temperature now, we're going to take it out of the pan. We're going to set it on a plate, and we're going to tent it with some foil and let it rest for a while. We're also going to remove that little cooling rack thing, that rack that we had the roast sitting on. So then we just take that out of there. Then we have to look at it and see how much fat there is in the bottom of that pan. If there's too much fat, you might want to drain some. I think that's just the right amount though. So what we're going to do is turn the heat back on this thing. Give it a little bit time to warm up. It won't take too long because it's a pretty hot frying pan. Then we're going to take the shallot that we diced up fine and put it in there. With those shallots sizzling away nicely, we're going to add just about 1/4 cup of white wine. That's going to deglaze the pan and lift all those great tasting brown bits off the bottom of that. It's going to really add a lot of flavor to the sauce. So just scrape the bottom of that pan a bit. And we'll let that white wine kind of cook down to about half its volume. Once that white wine is cooked down a little bit to concentrate the flavor, we're going to add some chicken stock. Some homemade chicken stock I got. It's got lots of schmaltz in it. We're going to let that come up to temperature. Once that's back up and bubbling away, we're going to take it and we're going to add about a teaspoon of Dijon mustard to it. That will whisk into that mixture. And that mustard will thicken it just a little bit, but we need to thicken it a bit more. So to thicken it, we're going to use just some cornstarch, a slurry mixed in some water. A little bit in there, and that looks like that's going to be just about right. Take that gravy out of there and we'll pour it in a little gravy boat. That's going to go awesome on our roast pork and our mashed potatoes.